समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Have you wondered why not every single European Union country uses the euro? Let's unravel this crucial but less understood European maze. And here's a trick question. How many Europes you think are there? Now, if your instinctive answer was one, well, you're wrong. In political Europe, they've created a Matrushka doll set of overlapping clubs and zones and unions that sound alike but aren't alike at all. So there's Europe, the continent, then there's the European Union, the EU, the Eurozone, and the Schengen area. And interestingly, none of these are identical. And to make it even more messier before I start the explanation, some EU members don't use the euro. Some non-EU states do use the euro. Some EU states are not in Schengen, and some non-EU states are in Schengen. So, Europe is not a simple European Union. Europe is a Venn diagram with commitment issues. For example, by 1st January 2026, Bulgaria will become the 21st Eurozone member, leaving just 6 EU states still holding on to their national currencies. So, why hasn't everyone joined the Eurozone when the EU explicitly treats Euro adoption as the end game? And if joining the Eurozone is so good, why is it that Poland, the EU's fastest growing economy today, still prefers to stay out? So let's piece it together. And as always, like I do with my explainers, I have broken this technical issue into 6 parts for easy comprehension. So part 1 is Europe versus EU versus Eurozone versus Schengen. And here's a quick guide for you. So before we get to the economics, let's clear the fog. First, Europe, a continent with about 44 to 51 countries, depending on where you draw the line and how flexible you are about geography versus geopolitics. Second, the European Union or the EU, a political and economic union of 27 countries sharing laws, regulations, and a single internal market based on free movement of people, free movement of goods, free movement of services, and free movement of capital. That's the EU's superpower. You can live, work, travel, sell, and move your money across member states like it's one giant country, just with more languages and fewer sunny beaches. And third, the Eurozone, as in the group of countries that use the euro. Now, Eurozone is a monetary union of 20, soon to be 21, countries sharing the euro. Now, this is not the same as the EU. It is a subset of EU nations plus some non-EU countries like Andorra, Monaco, San Marino, Vatican, etc. And then comes the Schengen area, which is a group of 29 European countries with open borders, no passport checks, no internal border controls, etc. And not all EU members are in the Schengen, and not all Schengen members are in the EU. And in other words, before I get to the explanation, EU is not equal to the Eurozone. EU is not equal to Schengen either. Schengen is not equal to Eurozone, which means geography is not equal to politics, is not equal to economy. Let's come to the part 2. How do countries get to use the euro? A country can't just wake up one morning and say, let's eurofy. Joining the euro area means joining the world's second largest reserve currency and the second most traded currency. Therefore, joining it requires passing the Maastricht criteria set in 1992 to prevent monetary chaos. It consists of economic and legal aspects. So, for example, the economic convergence criteria are as follows. First, price stability, which means that inflation in those countries cannot exceed 1.5 percentage points above the average of the 3 best performing EU countries. Second, sound public finances, which means government deficit should be less than or equal to, which means should not exceed 3% of GDP. Then government debt should not exceed 60% of GDP, because you can't share a currency with someone who maxes out their credit cards every December. Third, stable long-term interest rates, which means long-term borrowing rates should not exceed the three best performing EU states by more than 2 percentage points. This shows that market trusts your economy. And fourth, the exchange rate stability, or the ERM, which means spend at least 2 years with your currency pegged to the euro without major fluctuations, no devaluation, no sudden swings, no tantrums. Basically, your currency must prove it can demonstrate stability. And then the second part, which is the legal convergence, which means that national laws must guarantee the independence of the central bank, and legislation must align with EU treaties and European Central Bank rules. Every 2 years, the ECB and European Commission evaluate who's ready. And that brings us to the countries that are still holding out of the Eurozone. So part 3 is about the 6 EU countries that are still outside the Eurozone. In Northern Europe, these are Denmark and Sweden. In Central Europe, it's Czech Republic, Poland and Hungary. And in Eastern Europe, these are Romania and Bulgaria. However, Bulgaria is an exception here because it has cleared the convergence criteria and will join the Eurozone from 1st January 2026, which is merely a few days from now. So except for Bulgaria, all these countries are EU members but not Eurozone members. So are they out willingly? Are they in waiting? Or are they simply not ready? So there's some more twist. Each one of them, except Denmark, is legally obligated to adopt the euro someday. Now, why Denmark? Because Denmark negotiated an explicit opt-out in the 1990s. Everyone else is basically taking their time. And some, like Sweden, cleverly avoid joining exchange rate mechanism so that they can delay euro adoption indefinitely. Others, like Romania and Hungary, keep failing to meet the convergence criteria. Then there's Bulgaria, and I already told you about it, that after years in the ERM, they are finally in. But then comes the case of Poland, which is an interesting outlier. Poland is the fastest growing economy in a sluggish EU otherwise. It is often considered the poster boy of EU-funded transformation. But it has not shown the zeal in adopting the euro. And that brings us to part 4, which is obviously understanding why Poland is doing what it is doing. So Poland continues to be the Eurozone's most important no. Poland joined the EU in 2004 and turned EU funding into an economic growth machine. Infrastructure exploded. GDP surged. By 2025, Poland was the fastest growing economy in the EU, and it recently joined the $1 trillion GDP club, powered by high productivity, competitive labor, massive EU structural funds, an entrepreneurial, export-driven professional class, and yet Poland still uses the zloty. And public support for the euro there remains among the lowest in Europe. In fact, a 2025 research panel shows that only 26% of population support euro adoption, 74% oppose it, and 48% actually strongly oppose it. So why this resistance? The first explanation is, why fix what isn't broken? Poland is growing fast with the zloty. EU money is flowing. Inflation control is manageable. Then why voluntarily give up monetary sovereignty? Polish policymakers often say, we'll adopt the euro eventually, but not now, not while things are going well. Second, coasts of Greece, which means that in the mid-2010s, during the Eurozone crisis, a wave of Polish economists argued that the euro was dangerous, especially for countries without deep financial stability. The most influential critics, like Stefan Kavalik, who was also the author of the Euro Paradox, argued that euro makes borrowing too cheap. Cheap capital leads to excessive debt, and excessive debt leads to crisis. So in national currency systems, one country's crisis stays local. In the Eurozone, one crisis infects all. So their conclusion in 2016 was that the euro could be a trap. Now, it is true that the zloty gives flexibility. Poland likes having control over its interest rates, its exchange rates, and its monetary policy. When inflation jumps, the Polish central bank can raise rates aggressively. When exports need support, the zlotys can depreciate. Now, such flexibility is not there with the Eurozone. But here comes the reality check. By 2024-2025, inflation in the Eurozone was 2.2% on an average. But in Poland, it was 4.3%. In Hungary, it was 6.5%. In Romania, it was 4.9%. And finally comes the factor of politics and identity. For Poland, zloty remains a symbol of sovereignty, but the question is, until when? Now let me come to part 5. Why should we be bothered about the euro and the Eurozone? Which means, why am I giving you this explainer today? Despite skepticism, the euro is quite a powerhouse. 350 million Europeans use it daily. 60 countries and territories peg their currencies to it. It's the second most important international currency after the US dollar, and it makes up of 20% of global currency reserves. The euro gives stable long-term interest rates, cheaper borrowing, elimination of exchange rate volatility inside the Eurozone, a more powerful collective monetary footprint on the world stage. And for its citizens, travel becomes simpler, business becomes cheaper, savings become more predictable. And finally, let's come to the 6th part, which is the future of the Eurozone. And here I will tell you about Europe's coming capital union. And this is where it's going to get big. In 2024, former European Central Bank President Mario Draghi released a blockbuster report on Europe's competitiveness. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's called the Draghi Report. His warning was blunt. Europe cannot compete with the United States and China unless it creates a single capital market. So right now, the EU households save 1.4 trillion euros per year. But 300 billion euros of that goes outside the EU because Europe lacks a unified investment space. So what was Draghi's solution? He said a savings and investment union, sometimes also called a capital markets union. And what would this union aim to do? It would remove regulatory barriers across borders, pool European savings to finance European innovation, keep money inside Europe, not flowing to Silicon Valley or Asia. And here's the key point. Countries outside the Eurozone, like Poland, may struggle to be included despite being such wonderfully performing economies. And why is that? Because of exchange rate risk. No investor wants to fear sudden currency depreciation in the country where their assets are parked. So to be part of Europe's future investment union, euro adoption may become a de facto requirement. This is the new pressure point. The euro is no longer just about monetary stability. It is about competitive survival. And to conclude, I'd end with a few remarks on Europe's approach to its economy and building resilience into a complicated future. Now, it is clear that Bulgaria joining in 2026 is another step toward completing the euro puzzle, but it is not the last. Now, it is no longer about the Eurozone only. The EU is entering a new era that will build on common capital markets, deeper economic integration, a push to compete globally. Countries outside the euro will face harder decisions about whether they can stay outside without losing influence. So Poland's story is the most fascinating because of a booming economy, a confident national currency, but strong public rejection of the euro, at least right now. And yet, a future where staying out might limit Poland's role in Europe's next big transformation. So the euro began as a monetary experiment, and now it's becoming the backbone of Europe's competitiveness strategy. So the big question isn't whether the remaining EU members would join the Eurozone. The big question is, will staying outside the Eurozone cost more than getting in? And that moment may arrive sooner than non-Eurozone members expect. Now, with a 200 plus billion bilateral trade and an upcoming FTA with a promise of hundreds of euros in investments in India, economies of the Eurozone will be watched keenly in New Delhi. And I'll be back to discuss that more. Stay tuned.